Really? Okay, so she's really old school feminist.
Yeah. I don't think we can like change your ways about anything. It's just delightful. But, yeah. Estoy revisando el tiempo. You will have like an hour?
Yeah.
And then half an hour for Q&A.
Perfecto.
Great. So let's start with the first invited speaker of this conference. She is Saint Croixmp4, and she will present this really interesting paper on salience, fragmentation, and logical omniscience. Kat, I'm really glad that you're here, and you will have an hour for the presentation and then half an hour for the Q&A session.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And if anyone needs a handout, there are more here, and I believe you do. You're welcome. I'll put the extra handouts over here. Okay. Thank you all very much for being here. So I'm going to be talking through what is effectively a kind of bridging solution between this set of sort of rational shortcomings that we're sort of all subject to on a basically continual basis, and one of the solutions that I like, but that I think has difficulties with being sort of cognitively realistic. So let me give you sort of a quick overview of what I'm going to do in the talk, and then we'll get into it. So I'm going to start out by kind of introducing these two logical peccadillos. This word is pronounced peccadillo in English, but that sounds really terrible, especially here. But these sort of venial sins against logic that we all commonly commit. One of them is sort of going to be familiar to I think many of you from David Lewis's paper, Logic for Equivocators. And the other one is actually the problem that I first started thinking about on getting this invitation. Because I love invitations like this, especially one that's like, what we're looking for is non-classical solutions to traditional problems. And being sort of an epistemologist and being focused on attention, the epistemology of attention, in the last couple of years at least, I sort of immediately got to thinking about when I have taught things like introductory logic and the sort of peculiar rational shortcomings that come up in that context. So we'll come back to that. But as you'll see, sort of the project that has developed out of that is A, still in progress, and B, fits nicely with some of the other projects that are emerging in this area. So I'll introduce those two little venial sins, and then talk about what is, I think, the best candidate solution that is around, except for a couple of minor remaining problems with that solution, and that's fragmentation. One of the things that I particularly want to emphasize in giving the model that I'm going to give is that I think these two different problems in irrational cognition actually come from the same source. And so I think the version of fragmentation that I want to offer is one that does a nice job of kind of unifying the source of these two problems. So I'm going to talk through fragmentation and then transition into talking about what I think is that source, which is the relationship between salience and attention as aspects of our cognitive hardware, right? The operating system on which we can actually engage in rational thought. With that in mind, I'm going to introduce the notion of a salient structure, which is the model that I'm going to use to be kind of modifying this idea of fragmentation. With that in hand, we'll talk about salience fragmentation, which is this sort of revised version of fragmentation. And there you'll see some of the places that I think this model is still in progress. And then I'll talk through, if there is time, which I forgot to start my timer. I will talk through how this, I think, helps to handle the two cases that we'll start out with. So, getting started. Neither you, nor I, nor anyone we've ever met is by the standards of basically every classical theory of, and some non-classical theories, of epistemic logic, a rational agent, right? There are many, many reasons that this is so. In this talk, I want to focus on two of those reasons. The first of them is familiar from David Lewis's work on logic for equivocators, and it's the one represented in this little map on your first page, right? And that is that we have sort of mild inconsistencies dappling our thought all throughout the reasoning that we do. So Lewis, talking about this problem, writes, "I speak from experience as the repository of a mildly inconsistent corpus." By corpus is a technical term for just meaning sets of beliefs. "I used to think that Nassau Street ran roughly east-west, that the railroad ran roughly north-south, and that the two were roughly parallel. By roughly, I mean about 20 degrees. So each sentence is in an inconsistent triple that was true according to my beliefs, but not everything was true at once." And actually, if you look at the map on this, and if you've spent time in Princeton, you can see one of the non-highlighted lines is actually the little Princeton Junction Railroad that runs perpendicular to Nassau Street and to the main rail, which I think is probably explanatory of how Lewis got this poor misimpression, but we can set that aside for the present. The point is, there are these two features to draw from this. First, we often have these little inconsistent beliefs floating around, and yet we seem to muddle through life just fine. And two, that we don't seem to, in consequence of having those mild inconsistencies, explode into believing everything, right? We violate ex falso quod libet, and actually that seems to be to our benefit, right? So that's the first thing to be keeping in mind. The second is what I've decided to call somniscient inference as opposed to omniscient inference, right? And this, as I said, is the problem that I really got interested in, that sort of grabbed me thinking about this conference. Because, well, if you've taught introductory logic, or you've taken introductory logic, which I'm gonna guess you have since you're here, you might have noticed this particular phenomenon. So generally, when we teach that class, we introduce a sort of small but generous set of rules, right? This set of rules is, or should be, complete in the sense that you can use it to derive sort of anything that is entailed by the premises, right? But it's also redundant. Seldom do we give students a minimal set of rules, at least if we want them to pass the class or ever consider coming to a philosophy class again. Instead, we give them something that's a little easier to work with than just modus ponens. And I think this has an interesting consequence. From week to week, if you're the one grading these students' homeworks, you'll see that as the rules are introduced, students will find that the very same problem, can you derive X from Y and Z, show your work, will sort of wax and wane in difficulty, right? Some weeks it'll be very hard, some weeks it won't be that hard at all, and then it'll go back to being really hard. And that's pretty curious, right? Usually, though, what happens when it waxes is that they've learned some new rule, right? They've learned something like indirect proof that's really powerful. Oh, I can use this on everything, because you can start out with indirect proof kind of whenever you want. And I think what's interesting about this from the perspective of classical epistemic logic and logic more generally is that we don't have much of a way of talking about that difference in difficulty. Because of course, even if that student has done that proof in the past, the student who has learned one of these really powerful rules, like explosion or indirect proof, now has this heavy hammer that they're gonna aim to hit every single problem with, right? But of course, not all proof strategies are equally good. And so being drawn to this less apt proof strategy makes the proof harder. So From the perspective of formal epistemology, this is doubly odd. First, it is odd because formal epistemology lacks, as I said before, any way to represent the relative difficulty of inferences. And two, it's odd because under the auspices of classical logic, epistemic logic, not only should our students never suffer a problem like this twice, they shouldn't even suffer it once, right? They should be logically omniscient. All of the answers to how all of these derivations go should be locked in their minds, and alas, or maybe for us as the people teaching them, that's a good thing, but alas, they don't have them all recorded already. So, one further point here, a couple further points here, is that of course, in the classical context, there's also no distinction between the sort of venial sins against logic that our students commit and something more akin to a mortal sin of holding P and not P right in front of you at the same time, right? That's not what our students are doing. They're doing better than that most of the time. And second, before moving on, I think it's important to note that there's a good sense in which these two problems, the failure to see all the connections between all of your beliefs and the failure to infer from any set of rules immediately to the best possible proof, right? These, I think, should be understood, and I'm going to argue through this paper for a model that helps to see why that is, as coming from the same source, right? Is that we are cognitively limited, that there is a horizon beyond which, given what we are currently attending to, we simply can't see past, at least not by default. Okay. So one of the main kind of solutions to this sort of problem is fragmentation. In fact, this is the solution that Lewis himself proposes in that very same paper. According to the fragmentation hypothesis, our cognitive lives, as actual human beings, right, are broken into distinct, non-interacting fragments. So explaining this idea, Lewis writes of his initial confusion. Now, what about the blatantly inconsistent conjunction of the three sentences? I say that it was not true according to my beliefs. My system of beliefs was broken into overlapping fragments. Different fragments came into action in different situations, and the whole system of beliefs never manifested. The first and second sentences in the inconsistent triple were true according to different fragments. The third sentence belonged to both. The inconsistent conjunction of all three did not belong to, was in no way implied by, and was not true according to any one fragment. That is why it was not true according to my system of beliefs taken as a whole. Once the fragmentation was healed, straight away my beliefs changed. Now I think that Nassau Street and the railroad both run roughly northeast, southwest, which, as you can see from the map, is true. Fragmentation is usually understood as consisting of, or being sort of best characterized by 4 different criteria, or at least as of 2021. First is this F1, the total set of an agent's beliefs at time t is fragmented into separate belief states. F2, each belief state at t is a fragment whose constituent beliefs are consistent with each other and closed under logical consequence. F3, the belief states of a single agent are logically independent. They may not be consistent with each other, and the agent may not believe the consequences of his beliefs taken together. And F4, different belief fragments of an agent at T guide the agent's actions in different contexts or situations. So call this view standard fragmentation. And one thing I want to emphasize here is sort of how strongly many proponents of this view understand this idea of kind of a fragment or a mental file, right? Galen Strawson in his Predicate Logic and Grammar explains this idea of kind of a mental file as follows. He says, imagine a man in part as a machine for receiving and storing knowledge of all items which he already has some identifying knowledge. The machine contains cards. 1 card for each cluster of identifying knowledge in his possession. On receipt of an ordinary predicative invocation of one such cluster, the appropriate card is withdrawn. The new information is entered on it, and the card is returned to the stock, and so on, right? So we have not just like clusters of beliefs that sort of float around together, but discrete cards. That's the level of independence that we're sort of expected to take this take this view to employ. So I think this view has the virtue of handling the mild inconsistencies quite well, right? That one card says something that the other card denies, it's irrelevant, right? They're just separate cards. But two problems. First, this still requires a version of logical omniscience because it requires the beliefs in each fragment to be closed under logical consequence. And so, if we think that these problems come from the same source, there's no solution here, right? We've identified this like sort of kludge for handling one aspect, one consequence of the conditions that give rise to both problems, but that doesn't help us much with getting a model that's going to get rid of both problems at the same time or accurately kind of picture why it's happening to begin with. So that's the first problem. The second problem is one that bothers proponents of fragmentation to varying degrees. And it is that this view is somewhat mysterious, I think, right? It's a little strange to take human beings as this rigidly divided within themselves. You might think that it's sort of a cure worse than the disease if we're thinking about it in terms of this being like split personalities of beliefs, right? What we would like is a model, perhaps, that is a bit more organic, because we're a bit more organic. One of the things in the background here is that I think we tend to, when we have like a new technology, every metaphor becomes tied to that new technology. So a little bit of what's going on in the background here is I think that we get this sort of card file, this Dewey Decimal sort of understanding of the mind as a result of that technology being quite prominent for researchers at the time. And so we've moved on to mental files or computer files, et cetera, right? Okay. So, the version of fragmentation that I'm going to be developing, the salience fragmentation, is going to eschew with Adam Elga and, oh wow, his name just dropped out of my head, Augustin Rayo, eschew F2, right? We're going to drop out the idea that entailments between salient sentences are required, we're going to focus on the idea that all it is required of a rational agent is holding two entailments between salient sentences, which is in keeping with their view. So that's going to be dropping out the requirement for logical omniscience. And second, I'm going to put some pressure on how we interpret F3. Because the view that I'm going to develop distinguishes between fragments and the sentences salient in them, or the beliefs salient in them, we're going to be able to peel apart F3 a little bit, such that the fragments will be probabilistically dependent on one another, but won't require quite this extreme of a logical independence. Sorry, probabilistically reliant on one another without requiring the logical independence. I will explain that as we get there. So, the main device by which, the main sort of feature of our cognition that I think is missing from much of epistemology, and the main device by which I hope to remedy these two issues, are salience and attention, right? Our attention and what is salient to us makes a great deal of difference in our success as epistemic agents, right? So for example, if you want to know whether it's going to rain in the next hour, pertinent question today, your success in figuring out the truth of that proposition depends a lot on where you go for evidence. And where you go for evidence depends a lot on what is salient to you, right? If you turn to the National Weather Service, right, you're quite likely to get pretty good evidence, and you're quite likely to learn the truth more likely than you are from pretty much anywhere else. By contrast, if you consult only your aching knee joint, you'll probably gain very little useful evidence. I did look this up. But if it happens that you consult your knee and you turn out to be right, then consulting your knee probably becomes more salient in future inquiries as to whether it's going to rain in the next hour. Spurious correlation having very little impact on, there being very little difference between the impact of a spurious correlation and a genuine causal relationship, that is to say. So, point being, when you are deliberating about where to direct your attention, your achy knee in this sort of context where you've relied on it in the past and it's gone well, it's going to be highly salient. So the first thing I want to spend some time on is how we're going to understand salience. Salience concerns how likely something, an idea, an object, a concept, a memory, a sentence, how likely something is to attract your attention. Call these somethings attendibilia. Here I'm borrowing this term from Jesse Munton's forthcoming manuscript, Prejudice and Priority, which is all about the epistemology of salience and attention. Strong recommend. Skip it over. Sorry. As we're going to understand them, attendibilia are all part of your mental life. But they are things that are drawn not only from what is internal to you, the ideas, the sentences, et cetera, that you're thinking about, but also the perceptions that you're currently having, right? So I'm currently perceiving you. You yourself are not among my attendibilia, but my perception of you is, and my concept of you is, right? Similarly, when you step into the grocery store, right, the visual impressions of oranges, lemons, lettuce, everything else, all that fresh fruit gathered by the entrance, all of that enters your attendibilia alongside the recipe that you're thinking of for this evening, alongside the groceries you need to buy for the rest of the week, alongside the paper that you were working on before you peeled yourself off the couch because you had to do errands, and alongside the spat that has been living rent-free in your mind from the last department meeting for the last 2 weeks, right? All of these things are things to which you could attend upon entering the grocery store. Importantly, you are not equally likely to attend to any one of them, right? Looking at the map on the front page of this handout, for example, you are much more likely to attend to the pins and the highlighted items than you are to the label for Alexander Street. That's because the pins and the highlights are both large and so easily accessible, and similar and meaningful to you, right? You know that pins mean something important, so they're likely to grab your attention. But of course, if you grew up on Alexander Street in Princeton, then actually that's going to be really different, right? You're going to zero in on Alexander Street because you know it and it matters to you, right? There are a lot more things that matter here, right? You're more likely, for example, to attend to visual impressions arising from things that are near you, right? This is why brands fight for which shelf they go on at the grocery store. I also looked this up. They're right about this. You're much more likely to attend to things that are at the just below eye level shelf at the grocery store. You're more likely to attend to things that are to the left or right of the thing you're currently attending to than the things that are well above it or well below it. Conceptual linkages matter here too. If you're attending to the limes, you're more likely to attend to the lemons than you are to the mint, unless of course you're trying to make a mojito, in which case maybe mojitos are very salient to you because you had a good date in which you had mojitos. Well done. So now you're looking for mint whenever you come across the limes, and so the mint becomes really salient to you whenever you see the limes, right? And if you always buy yourself a Honeycrisp apple whenever you go to this grocery store, the Honeycrisp bin is going to be super salient to you. Point being, the likelihood of your attention shifting from one object to another depends on a host of factors, which I think we can boil down to the 4 listed on your handout. First, the attendibilium upon which you're currently focused. One thing to say here is that there's a question about modeling in the background here that has to do with whether you can focus on one attendibilium or whether we coarse grain out to a section of things that you're attending to. This is matters to the details of actually building the model, but I don't think much hangs on it. So I'll assume that you're only attending to one thing for the sake of simplicity, but that can be sort of complicated as one pleases. So the attendibilium you're currently focused on matters, as does the environment, right? The walking into the grocery store. as does your personal history. The good date with the mojito, always buying yourself a Honeycrisp, right? These things matter. And of course, how you are directing your attention. Here, what I mean is kind of the task that you are currently focused on, right? So when you go to the grocery store, you are attending to the task of getting the things on your grocery list. How successfully you do that is a different matter. But I think at this point you might be wondering what it actually means to attend, so we'll transition to attention itself. I think attention is best understood as operating on both a structural level and a selectional level. These two levels represent two very different accounts of attention. So Sebastian Wotzel attends this sort of organizational understanding of attention, and Wayne Wu defends a selective understanding of attention. I'm going to sort of go through both of these and then talk a little bit about why I think actually they're better understood as working in tandem. So at the structural level, the idea is that what you are doing is organizing your stream of consciousness, right? This is a sort of first personal thing that you do. And the sort of point of Sebastian's account is to capture this phenomenological experience of attending, that you are sort of focusing in on, say, a beloved pet, right? When you focus on your pet, the things that are relevant to the pet become the center of your attention, right? They're easier to attend to for you than everything else, at least if you're doing a good job of attending to your pet. So, you know, the pet purring on your lap, the treats that you have in the fridge for them, the ball on the floor, right? Those things become more central to your phenomenological experience of consciousness than, say, the dishes that need to be washed in the sink still, or to that project that you need to get done for this evening, right? That is what attending does, is organize your stream of consciousness. At the selective level, attention is selection for action, right? So you sort of organize what is easiest, you make it easier for yourself to access different parts of different attendabilia, and what you actually select is this sort of ground level understanding of what attention is. Here, this can be either volitional, either first personal, or it can be subconscious, right? One of the things that Wu's account does a very nice job of is sort of marrying these two levels of attention where right now you're all sort of working really hard to like fend off the email notifications and texts and stuff and focus in on talking to me, but if there's a really loud bang outside, we'll all attend to that because there's a sort of bottom-up version of attention that grabs your attention sort of without regard to how much you want your attention to be focused here, right? Going back to the sort of pet example, right? What you actually end up selecting, whether it's the treats, the purring on your lap and the petting, or the toy, that's the second level, the selective level of attention. So while Wotzel and Wu argue that they are offering sort of competing accounts, I think that we can regard them as operating in tandem. The structural attention makes certain attendabilia more salient to you, and selective attention determines which attendabilia you actually focus on. Here, I think a nice way to understand this is an experiment with which you might be familiar, which is the invisible gorilla experiment. So this was carried out by Simons and Chabris in the 90s. And you might have seen this video sort of floating around online of a group of people in a gymnasium with a ball that they're passing back and forth, right? And participants in the experiment are asked to count the number of bounces, not the number of passes, between people in the video. And at the end of the video, the researchers ask the participants in the experiment, oh, hey, did you see the gorilla who walked through the scene as you were counting the passes? And about half of the people say, what? No, what? There wasn't a gorilla. I was very carefully watching, right? And it's a pretty consistent result. And I think one way to understand what's going on here is we have these two different levels of attending, right? At the organizational level, at sort of Wotzel-style level, what is happening is that the participants in the experiment are focusing deeply on the ball, the hands of the people who they're watching, right? Everything that is relevant to counting ball passes. And everything outside of that is sort of falling below what, as we go forward, I'm going to call an attentional horizon. So they really have a hard time. It becomes very low probability that they'll even be able, at this selective level, to alight on something like the gorilla walking through in the background. Now, if that gorilla came with like a big loud sound or something else that really grabbed their attention away, it might push the gorilla above that attentional horizon. But understanding these two different levels as doing the work, I think actually makes a much clearer account of what's going on there than just, oh, they didn't notice, right? So that's these two different levels. And to relate them, I think it's quite helpful to build up a bit of a model. So Jesse Munton, in the same manuscript, argues that we should understand salience at a kind of structural level. Given that we are attending to one object, there is an accessibility relation between that object and all the other possible attendabilia that determines the probability with which we'll make that transition. That relation is going to be weaker or stronger given S1 through S4 that we talked about above, right? Given that suggestion, and with the observations of the previous section, I think we can model this idea as a directed graph, right? And that's going to consist of a set of nodes that are the attendabilia, right? The concepts, objects, sentences, et cetera, that you can attend to, and edges being these accessibility relations between those nodes. These are going to be a weighted accessibility relation, a weighted edge, right? To kind of bring that to life a little bit, we'll go back to the figuring out whether it's going to rain in our example. So suppose again that you're attending to this question of whether it's going to rain. That question itself is going to be among the possible attendabilia, so that node is labeled Q in the digraph on your handout. And there are going to be like a bunch of sort of irrelevant attendabilia that are not pictured here, because their probability is going to be fairly low if you're successfully focusing your attention, right? But so too will be these other things, these possible locations for evidence that we talked about above, right? The National Weather Service, that's W on your handout, the node W, and your knee, which is the node K. So we'll assume that if this is your salient structure, you've maybe had some success with consulting your knee, or you heard that if your knee hurts, that's somehow related to whether it's going to rain. So it's like an option. But you can see by the weights here that you're much more likely to consider the National Weather Service because you're a reasonable person. Yes? So you can see there that the weights between Q and itself, it's a very low weight. Maybe you just keep thinking about the question. You're too anxious to actually move on to one of these other things. It's just really important. It's bothering you. But then you have a weight of 2 to K, a weight that is, say, your knee, and a weight of 4 that is, say, twice as much weight on W. These weights are meant to be, they're sort of cardinal. We'll use them to calculate probabilities over the total weight available, right? And then if you transition to your knee, right, well, that's going to be connected to other possible attendabilia, like maybe because you're focusing on the pain in your knee, oh, that toe pain that has been bothering you. That becomes more salient. But there's no link between focusing on your toe pain, which, as you'll see, has a very high weight to itself, because once you're there, it's kind of an attention sink, right? But there's no link between your toe pain and the weather page. But if you do get to the weather page, there's a link between the weather page and the flashing red banner at the top of the weather page. It's like, oh my God, there's a hurricane coming. This matters a lot, right? And so once you get to the weather page, you're quite likely, as you'll see, 3, a weight of 3, to shift your attention to that warning, right? At least on this, for this agent. So what's valuable about this is that this salient structure allows us to determine transition probabilities, right? For the agent represented in figure 1, there's a 4/7 chance that they switch to the weather service in their next step, right? 2/7 that they consult their knee, 1/7 that they stay where they are. But if they shift to their knee, there's an equally likely chance that they go anywhere else, right? But if they get to their achy toe, there's only a 20% chance that they get back on task, right? More generally, the salient structure can be used to determine the sort of Markov transition surface that an agent reaches any particular attendabilium from a particular starting point, either at the limit or within a certain number of steps. You can see in the figure 3 there, that is the transition probabilities within 2 steps from Q, the question itself. And then should they transition to focusing on the weather service, the transition probabilities within 2 steps from looking at the weather service. So like they're most likely, in that case, to transition within 2 steps to be thinking about the warning label. They're very unlikely to get back to the toe, right? Not impossible, but unlikely. Okay. But all of that assumes that the salient structure remains fixed. What if it doesn't? So one of these sort of key features of this kind of understanding of our salience, what is salient to us, is that it changes with a lot of different features, right? Not only with how our attention moves, but with how the environment changes, as we've kind of been emphasizing, with our history, right? So to take kind of an example of that, suppose that as you're considering this question, the phone rings, right? Because you like forgot to turn the ringer off, and you forgot to turn off calls from unknown numbers. So you're like, oh my God, the phone is ringing. What in the world, right? This is going to be a really high salience occurrence from any one of the possible nodes that you might be at in that salient structure. And so we represent that by adding a node. This is an environmental change that has with it quite high weights relative to the other weights in the diagram. Of course, not all changes in your environment are salience-relevant changes in your environment, right? If there's like a little bug that crawls on the floor here and you're sitting 2 rows back, that's not going to be a salience-relevant change in your environment because you're not going to see it. But many changes are relevant. And so to kind of build out this model, oh yeah, I should say, one of the other ways that this can change is, of course, the task that you're doing changing, right? So in this model that I have on the handout, the thing that you're focusing on is answering this question. But if you end up focusing on, if you end up sort of attending to that red banner node, this whole structure might blow up because you're worried about the hurricane coming, right? You're going to have to spend the rest of the day getting groceries for the next 2 weeks. You're going to have to make sure you have enough fresh water, all this stuff that you weren't planning to do today that is going to radically change your salient structure. So we'll need a change function to handle this kind of thing. So building out this model further, we'll have a change function that takes in, we'll have a set of all possible attendabilia for the agent, a salient structure consisting of a set of attendabilia and edges that are edges from the cross product, along with cross product of the nodes, along with a weight coming from the set of real numbers, and then a set of all of the salient structures, and the function itself will take in not only your current salient structure, but also the task that you are switching to if you are changing, changes in the environment, the attendabilium that you're focusing on, and it would then output a new salient structure. One of the sort of further tasks for developing this model is figuring out sort of what kind of consistency conditions might best represent how we actually reason, right, between different sorts of changes that will be represented in this sort of change function. Okay. So that's the idea of a salient structure. And the thing that I want to draw out of that, sort of most important piece of this, has to do with what's not pictured. So not pictured are the many other things that you could be attending to. Dinner this evening, the Poincaré conjecture, and so on. That's because those accessibility relations have excessively small weights relative to the weights pictured here. Presumably, for example, dinner this evening has a small, though increasing as the day goes on, link between itself and any of the other nodes that you're attending to, right? And of course, that's because your body throughout the day is going to be producing hormones that make it salient to you that you need to eat. It doesn't really matter what you're transitioning from. And of course, other people will be like, hey, do you want to go to dinner, right? And that's also going to raise the salience of that particular node. But I think the Poincaré conjecture is a little different here. If you've been thinking about the Millennium problems lately, then it might have some sort of relatively high general salience for you, right? Where that's just it's got a low, but actually maybe above the horizon weight from any of the nodes that you're attending to. I think this is actually closely related to the sort of when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail phenomenon, right? It has high general salience. But it might be also that prior to this mention of it, you hadn't thought about the Poincaré conjecture in years. If so, then it simply wouldn't have been accessible to you from any of the currently salient nodes in your salient structure. Doesn't mean you didn't have any beliefs about it, or you didn't know about it. It's just that it wasn't accessible to you from where you are. It takes some sort of change in your task, in your environment, like the handout that you're looking at or me talking about it, to make it accessible to you, right? In the latter case, what I want to say is that the Poincaré conjecture was, for you, below your attention horizon, where the thought is that the attention horizon is sort of de minimis threshold below which attendibilia are insufficiently salient to be accessible in a real manner to the agent from their current salient structure. Of course, it's an empirical question, what exactly that weight would be, and it's probably actually going to be quite small, given that the toy structure that I have here has 5 or 6 nodes in it. Of course, our actual salient structure would have many, many, many nodes in it, depending on sort of how you are perceiving the world as you're perceiving it. Right now, of course, every one of you is a node for me, as is every sentence that I'm looking at on my handout as I'm going through it, right? We have hundreds of nodes in any salient structure that is actually representable, that is actually sort of has any fidelity to our experience. So this threshold is probably going to be quite tiny. But nevertheless, it's pretty clear that there are things that we just can't get to, except under very strange circumstances, given where we are, given the salient structure that we do have. That, again, is the sort of thought that I'm trying to draw out for the invisible gorilla experiment, right? For some of those participants who are just really focused in, the gorilla is just too low salience to be something that they alight on at this selective level. And this is going to be, this idea of the attention horizon is going to be the foundation of this version of fragmentation, sort of work our way back to the topic of the talk, that I want to develop in the next couple of sections. So, and this is the part of the project that is very much in progress, but the thought goes like this. Rather than understanding fragments as discrete, relatively fixed, independent folders in the mind, we should understand fragmentation as a consequence of the agent's salient structure, right, and their focal attendibilium. So I'm sort of defining the current fragment, your current fragment that you're in right now, as consisting of all of the attendibilia above the attention horizon in your current salient structure. On this view, then, as an agent shifts focus within their salient structure, they may or may not change fragments, right? So if you are the person, so actually here's a better example. If you, the last time, if you're focusing on this, is it gonna rain the next hour question, and you work your way down to your achy toe, but the last time that you were thinking about the Poincare conjecture, you stubbed your toe really badly. And so there's this like low weight connection between pain in your toe and the Poincare conjecture. In that case, when you get yourself down to your toe pain, that might actually be enough to bring the Poincare conjecture above that attention horizon. Might make it something that you might actually just happen to alight on as you're thinking about this weather question more broadly. Otherwise, though, if it's not so related to your painful toe, it's not going to rise above that attention threshold. So as you move around, if all 5 of those nodes, the only nodes that can rise above that horizon for you at the moment in the current environment, given the salient structure that you have, then those switches don't change your fragment, right? Okay. So then, given that idea, we need a kind of a notion of belief to get back to this kind of epistemic logic. What I want to suggest then is that recalling that sentences are among an agent's attendabilia, belief then is a matter of how an agent is disposed to evaluate a sentence. If you're kind of familiar with work in epistemology, I am drawing here a lot from Pamela Hieronymi's views on what it is to believe, sort of evaluative understanding of belief. If you're not familiar with that view, don't worry about it, it's fine. But the thought is that belief simpliciter is being such that an agent is, we'll say, S believes P just in case S is disposed to evaluate P as true whenever P is made salient in a particular fragment. So if you are in this fragment that you're currently in and somebody says, oh, is the Poincare conjecture undecided, right? And you go, ah, yes. No matter whether you're in this fragment or any other fragment, then we would say that you simply believe that proposition or that sentence. And then we'll say belief in a fragment, right, is the sole fragment version of this. So if you're disposed in a particular fragment to evaluate that proposition as true, then we'll say that you believe that in that fragment, right? Okay. So you might be wondering, hey, how are you deciding whether I evaluate what as true? This is a good question. And here I'm going to come back to the paper that I found while working on this question, which is Elga and Rayo's really lovely and kind of wild 2021 paper on fragmentation that is also developed to kind of handle this logical omniscience question, where they offer this idea of an access table. So the access table encodes the information that is available to agents under different conditions. So you can see on the left, we have like C sub 1, C sub 2, right? These are the different conditions. And on the right, associated with that, is a particular probability function. Notice not credence function, but probability function. That probability function represents, as I said, the information that is available to the agent under those choice conditions and may not be available to them under any other conditions. Rational agents, on the view that Elga and Rayo develop, must be logically competent, right? But they need not be logically omniscient. A logically competent agent is one that respects obvious entailments between salient sentences under the choice conditions at which they are salient. Obvious entailments, they sort of operationalize as classical Boolean connectives with their standard meanings as they pertain only to the salient sentences. Importantly here, to kind of square the circle on that, Elga and Rayo employs semantically deviant possible worlds in order to, rather than impossible worlds, in order to maintain the possibility of coherent probability functions that nevertheless don't respect entailments between all sentences. And important to remember here that it is the entailments between sentences and not propositions that they're worried about. Further clarification, what is obvious for them is not what is true according to the probability function that you have access to, That is to say, if A then B is obvious and A is obvious, the rational agent on their view has to take B to be obvious. But even if B then C is true for them, if it's not obvious, then they don't have to respect the entailment to C, right? That is to say, it doesn't have to be obvious to them that's C. Okay. So this picture, as is pretty obvious, is a version of fragmentation, right? But it has, though it manages to avoid logical omniscience, at least in the sort of noxious way that it requires a current belief, right? You might quibble about the probability functions, and I would delight in quibbling about the probability functions. It still has the sort of split personality problem that fragmentation has, right? There's no clear relationship between different fragments, and there's really no way to build up a relationship between them on this view. There's also no way to talk about which sentences are salient in this view. They're just sort of there in the conditions, maybe, maybe not. So what this project is doing at this point is hooking up this kind of model that Elga and Ryo give with the salient structure model that's been built. So the thought is that we can take salience fragments as choice conditions, right? Except that now we have a lot more structure about how different choice conditions relate to one another, right? And then the sentence is salient within the salience, within the sort of salience fragment that you're in. Those are the sentences to which you are epistemically responsible, and no others. One thing that I think is nice about this version is that it also will allow us to generalize. So Elga and Ryo, as I said, sort of do this like classical Boolean operationalization to make the obviousness function that they develop in their view work. The view that I'm trying to develop here will allow us to kind of generalize on that because I'm going to argue, as I'll talk about when we get to these solutions that I have, oh good, a few minutes left for, that have rather than the sort of set of Boolean conditions on the obviousness function that they go for, that will take the rules that are obvious to the agent, they're sort of salient, that is, to the agent in her particular salience fragment as the rules to which she is logically responsible. And if we are evaluating the rationality of an agent, then we might say, if we are classical logicians, which, boo, we're not here, that they should have a classically complete set of rules salient to them. But if we are intuitionists, we can require that they have a viable intuitionist set of rules, inference rules, salient to them, and that those are the ones out to a number of steps that we expect them to be responsible to. Okay, so that's the basic idea. That's sort of where the project is going, and I want to sort of fill that out by sketching out for you how this model treats the two cases with which we began. So the idea, drawing it all together, is that if an agent's salient structure makes the relevant sentence or inference inaccessible, then it's unreasonable to regard her as irrational for failing to respond to that, right? That is to say, we should evaluate the rationality of an agent relative to her attention horizon. And since this threshold demarcates fragments on this view, then we are evaluating her relative to salience fragments. So coming back to Lewis's problem, the deliverance of this view is exactly what you would expect, which is that there's no fragment that Lewis has encountered in which all three of those sentences were salient at the same time, right? And as soon as he does encounter them, he doesn't evaluate them as true. At this point, I think it's worth considering what it means to kind of reason, because we're now talking diachronically, right, under this view. And at the moment, I'm going to take this page as well from Elga and Ryo, who argue that what we do as we sort of move through a sequence of reasoning is conditionalize the probability functions that you gain access to on the information that was salient within that extended period of reasoning. The difference is that this view allows us to if we take what you are attending to, what is in your salient structure, to be expanding, right? It gives us an account of what's actually happening there. And insofar as we think that the number of nodes that you're able to attend to has to do with how cognitively challenging it is to do the task that you're doing, right? This actually starts to give us an account of the difference in difficulty between different inferential moves, right? And that, I think, is going to bring us back to our somniscient logic students. So recall that the problem with our logic students was that, in week 1, the only rule that they had with respect to being given, say, the premises A or B and not B was disjunctive syllogism. And they go, well, I can do that. I can just disjunctively syllogize. And so they do. But then in week 2, you've given them this whole plethora of new rules. You've given them these really powerful rules like indirect proof, and they kind of forgot a little bit about disjunctive syllogism. It's not that they don't know about it. It's not that if you asked them about it, they wouldn't understand what you were asking about. It's just below the attention threshold, right? It's well below the horizon. So for them, they have to start out trying to do this problem, unless they're with their particularly well-studied friends in their study group who know how to do this already. They start out alighting on this rule that is highly salient to them, indirect proof, because of how powerful it is, because they watched their professor do a whole bunch of weird proofs that they had never seen before, and they just worked with this weird method, with this one weird trick. So that's where they start. And as they continue on in this problem, they start complaining about how hard it is because it's really difficult to get through it, because they have to keep more and more in mind as they start realizing that this indirect proof strategy is actually not going to work that well. And so they have to go on to these other things. They have to ask other people about what they might be missing, right? And so they complain to you, oh, this was so hard. Oh, it took me forever, right? And the reason it took forever is not that they didn't know how, but that it wasn't salient to them how, right? The best strategy was no longer salient, so they had to spend a lot more time searching for a good strategy than they would have had to the week prior. So that's the kind of overall view. There's work yet to do in discerning and sort of figuring out how to understand sort of coherence requirements between probability functions that you might alight on that are near one another in your salient structure. And more work to do on figuring out exactly how to characterize the rules that are salient to agents in a particular salient structure. But that is the project. What I've tried to do in this project is develop a formal model of salient structures, give a sort of psychologically realistic picture of fragmentation that avoids some of the mysterious features of the standard view, show how two sort of familiar logical peccadillos might arise from the same cognitive limitation, and show how salience fragmentation can be used to fill out the psychological picture that Elga and Ryo develop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kat.
Yeah.
So yes, questions. We start with Raimundo and then you.
I have been waiting for this talk for like 30 years. I wrote about obvious inferences many years ago, and
Oh, really?
this is beautiful to me. For me, the locus classicus of inference and attention is the beginning of the murders of the Rue Morgue.
Oh, sure.
It's beautiful when the Chevalier Dupin is able to predict the inferences of his friend just by tracking his attention.
I love that.
It's wonderful.
Yes.
So you bring a lot of light into this, and I think it's very possible that your way is the correct way to handle this. Now my question is, how do we go further on that? Because you are making a good case for just the rationality based on what is available to the subject. Including psychologically available, yes. We should not be afraid of that. That doesn't mean that we're making logic psychological, we still have these logical requirements. But now we say contextualize
Yeah.
to the situation.
Yeah.
The trouble for me is that this situation itself is in a broader context of reasonableness. When is an attention horizon reasonable?
Yeah.
Because there are some of us that have a very bad horizon. Or some things tend to distract us very easily, and you say, come on, be reasonable. That's not sensible
Yeah.
of you to get distracted that easy. So there seems to be some notion of rationality that is going to encompass not only the logical aspects of my competence given what is available, but also the process that makes material available for inference, and how I select and how I distinguish what I'm going to pay attention to, what will be salient.
Good. Sorry, I'm writing some of this down. This is really lovely. Yeah, good. So I think they're kind of like two broad areas, and then within the broad area, within this area, there are two sub-questions. So there's the question of like what the agent, given where they are right now, can actually do, right? And then there's the sort of normative stuff. And the normative stuff, I think there are two separate areas. There's like what we're gonna say is epistemically required, and then what is like logically rational, right? And so over here, yeah, I think this, along, like once we've sort of done a little bit more to tie it down to psychological reality, I think is a decent picture over here. Here, I think what I've been doing in some of the work that I've been doing has to do with the role of attention in epistemic normativity more generally. And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is developing a conception of epistemic normativity that is sensitive to the capacities of the agent, but is still recognizably epistemically normative, right? And so I think, for example, like we should think that an agent who has like a really severe attention deficit disorder just has different obligations epistemically than somebody who doesn't. And I think we are developing a better picture if we have one that like respects the cognitive differences between different agents in that way. And so I think that on the picture that I've been developing, we have sort of both epistemically normative and morally normative obligations to condition our attention in different ways. So like, what I mean by that is when you take up birding, for example, right, you spend a bunch of time like listening to different bird calls, and you develop new attentional capacities as you do that, right? Like you can go out in the exact same woods and have like the same external environment that is providing you the sensory experience and perceive that same sensory experience very differently because of the way that you've trained yourself to attend to different aspects of bird calls, like whether there's a rhythm like this or the pitch of the call, whatever. There's different things that without that training, you don't have the capacity to attend to. And so I think like there are sort of obvious moral cases there, right? Like you should attend to the well-being of the people around you, right? You should be disposed in that way, like that's a morally good disposition. Epistemically, I think this comes down to some of the sort of recent developments in zetetic epistemology, right? So the question there is going to be, I think about kind of maximizing the value, maybe maximizing or satisfying is better, of the inquiry that you're engaged in. And so one of the dispositions that is sort of epistemically required to develop is a capacity to continue to focus your attention over the course of an important inquiry. And I think like that's not something that maybe until the last 10 years, 15 years, at least like Western contexts have thought much about as a skill that you have to develop, but it's now becoming something that as we are constantly being bombarded with like Instagram notifications and Snapchat notifications and Facebook notifications and texts, that we're all realizing is a really important skill. And I think we should understand that as an epistemic obligation. That like attention is not just like something you're born with, but it's something you practice. And so I think there's an epistemic obligation there. There's other question about like what this sort of other branch of evaluation is like, how should we evaluate like which rules you're responsive to? Like if you're only responsive to intuitionistic rules, is that a bad thing, right? And there I think that's where we're back to questions about like what are good logics for kind of working with belief and stuff, and like that's the sort of normal purview of Studia Logica and other sort of places like episteme, right? That's the work that we're doing there. And so I think if you are sort of the intuitionistic partisan, then you'll say, the rules that like a rational agent needs to be responsive to are intuitionistic rules out to n steps, where the number of steps of inference is going to be like everything that is entailed within those steps, within a proof that follows those rules. And that, I think, is a matter of, like, clearly infinity is the wrong threshold. What the correct threshold there is, I think, probably best understood in relation to the experience and capacities of the agent, but I think that's up for debate. So, but that is a super helpful question, and I'm excited to go reread Murders in the Rue Morgue. Thank you.
Next one, Thomas, please.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, in the salient structures, right, the edges are sort of ways to pull one's attention or draw one's attention from one node to another. But there also seem to be other relationships that hold between nodes. And the weird thing that I kept on thinking about was Freud, right? If you go to the case studies, like the dialogues tend to be like, oh, you thought you were tending to X, or you were tending to X, but by the way, you were inevitably also tending to Y. And that led me to think about analyticity in this case. If I'm tending to a particular concept, it may decompose into other concepts. And there is some relationship that holds then between I'm tending to bachelorhood. Part of that is that I'm inevitably also tending to unmarriedness, unmarriedicity.
Unmarriedicity? Yes.
But I wondered if you've thought about other relationships or what might be happening when my attention is not just drawn, but it's also, there's more complicated relationships between the nodes in the graph.
Yeah, this is a really excellent question. So I think that one kind of important aspect of leaning on things that Sebastian Watzel is thinking about is in terms of like the sort of first personal understanding of attending as this like extended process where you are orienting your stream of consciousness around P. That is as you take it, right? So like if I think that I am attending to my best friend, but turns out my best friend is actually like stabbing me in the back and not my best friend, I'm still doing the same thing even though I'm factually incorrect about the guise under which I'm doing it, right? And so I think there what's happening is, and this is one of the reasons that I, in fact, would really prefer to be doing this with impossible worlds as the basis rather than semantic deviance, because I think impossible worlds do a much better job of capturing the weird stuff that we believe. But I'm going to set that aside for the moment. But I think that, yeah, these are all like under the guise that you, the agent, has them. And this is sort of like what Strawson is talking about in the passage that I quoted earlier is very much this like Hesperus, Phosphorus sort of problem. Like you might not know that Hesperus and Phosphorus are the same, and so when you pull the Hesperus card, right, it doesn't link up to the Phosphorus card at all. Like they're just different cards. And so the fact that they, in fact, pick out the same objects doesn't matter to the salient structure that you develop, because you don't know that. Once you learn that they are, then we would expect a lot of reorganization of salient structures for you, because you'd be like, oh no, I should be thinking about these things together. And of course, like, now, because we've all learned that same paper, we all immediately, when we hear Hesperus, go, boop, phosphorus, right? Like the salience relation between, the edge between those two is really, really strong for all of us. But I think the analyticity question more broadly is like, yeah, you can just be very wrong about the compositional relationships. So like if you don't know the bachelors have to be unmarried, then you're going to be attending to bachelorhood to your mind. But I would look at your salient structure and be like, Thomas, what are you doing? If I could look at your salient structure.
We're not that close.
So that's the thought there. I think with the, sorry. With respect to the sort of Freudian point, I really love this point because I think there is this question about like how these weird connections get made, like why when you start thinking about cats, do you start thinking about pizza? Well, it's because you watched Samurai Pizza Cats as a kid. And even though you've completely forgotten about Samurai Pizza Cats, it was a great show. There's still this link that you like can't explain between cats and pizza. And I think this view, some of the other work that I'm working on with Jesse Munchin right now is working on how, is giving a model of the evolution of salient structures in response to rewards. And one of the things that we would expect in there is that that link between cats and pizza gets reinforced when you're little, and then even though you forget about other nodes in your salient structure, because like you just haven't thought about Samurai Pizza Cats since the 90s. So it's well below the attentional threshold, that link is still there, right? That link can survive even though the stuff that made that link show up hasn't been salient to you for a long time. So that's kind of the thought there, which is to say like there are a lot of deliverables that need to show up for this to make sense. Does that help?
No, absolutely, yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Maria, and then Alejandro, and then Brad.
And yeah.
Uh,
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk. I was wondering, I couldn't order my question, so it's going to be a bit messy. But I was wondering about the picture of the agent inside of a particular context when they are highly experts. So the logical competence is extremely high. And so I was wondering, in those cases, does it need to mirror very much a sense of being logical omniscient? And the reason why I have this in mind is in the cases of inconsistent science, there is a very popular case of cosmology, Newtonian cosmology, people saying that it was inconsistent. And then when people look at the historical record, it is very obvious that there was no point in which scientists had access to all the information needed for making the inconsistency happen. So in abstract, yes, the theory could be inconsistent, but in particular historical context, nobody was believing that part of the inconsistency was actually happening. So they didn't have access to that information.
Yeah,
and
that's nice.
one of the evidence that people often provide is that they could reason almost perfectly with that with the information that they had. So I was wondering, how does that look very different from being logical omniscient in those particular contexts?
Yeah, what an awesome question. I'm like, yeah, so I really like the idea that like kind of one way we can understand expertise is as having like having like more steps of inference in your salient structure with respect to the things about which you are an expert. I think the Newtonian case is just a really beautiful example of that, where like as soon as if they did have access to that, they'd be like, oh crap, this all falls apart. But lacking access to it, there's just no way that you're gonna, you will or should conclude that the view is inconsistent. Yeah. That's a very exciting idea, and I don't really have much to say other than that. I think that's exactly like this sort of idea that like we should characterize expertise in terms of like steps of inference on this view that you have access to, and like as you move towards something that looks like logical omniscience, which like we're not going to get to, but like you're much closer than say your students, right? That like that's a way of demarcating expertise. I think that's just a really cool way to take the view, and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Brad, please.
Oh, okay. That was super interesting. I have a bunch of questions. I'll limit it. So I guess my first question is about your account regarding Lewis. Because it seems to me, so you kind of, you explain how it's, well you say, you explain why he doesn't have, in a sense, why he doesn't have irrational beliefs, or why it's unreasonable to regard him as irrational. But it still seems like there's something wrong with what he was doing. And I guess my first question is, like, how does your account explain the error?
Yeah, I think, so this is like, among people who support this kind of idea of fragmentation, there's this long debate about like, is it irrational to be fragmented? Is it not irrational? My sort of line, I think, on this, and let me know if this is satisfying, is that it's rational but non-ideal, right? So that's what we would say about Lewis in that case, is that, yeah, he's perfectly rational given where he is, but he's a non-ideal agent. And then there's a question there, I think, about whether we want to say that agents have some obligation to, as best they can, approach the ideal, right? Like, I think this might actually be one of the few cases in which like approximating the ideal might actually generally be positive, as opposed to like social cases where we're like, yes, if you just like give everybody the same amount of money at the same time, like that might cause weird economic consequences that actually are less ideal, and blah, blah, blah. In many cases, approaching the ideal is difficult. I think this might be one where there's sort of two different ways to understand rationality. There's like rationality in situ, and then the sort of approaching the ideal, where what we might want of an agent is that there aren't cases in which were you to conjoin the beliefs that you have in one fragment and another, you would have to have, I guess, a sort of like stochastic response to that, right? Because you're not going to be able to just conditionalize from there.
That's a follow-up to that? Oh, so, and then I have a big question. But my follow-up to that is just, I mean, it seems like intuitively, after the fact, when Lewis realizes, when all three become salient, he would say, oh my God, I was totally inconsistent. But what you're saying is, doesn't seem like it accounts for that. I mean, you're saying that it wasn't ideal, but it wasn't inconsistent. But it seems like intuitively, what Lewis would say is, it wasn't that it wasn't ideal, I was inconsistent. It was non-ideal because I was inconsistent. So that doesn't seem to jibe with that a little bit to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fair. Right, Lewis shouldn't look at that and go, well, that's fine.
I could have done better. Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's certainly the case that the account should say, when you find yourself in that kind of situation, you have a reason to render yourself consistent, right? You shouldn't go, whoa, gosh, you should back away from that and just leave it, right? You should repair. I think maybe the, yeah, I'll have to think more about how exactly to handle that. Because the thing that I'm thinking about right now is like having consistent dispositions. Because the thing that I would say originally in that case is like, oh, we wouldn't say that Lewis believes simpliciter that the railroad runs this direction or that direction, because he's got pretty inconsistent dispositions, right? And so there's like a general push toward having more consistent dispositions, but that won't work straightforwardly because there are cases in which we do want people to have inconsistent dispositions.
Right.
Like you should not behave the same way
Right.
like at home or on a date
Right.
as you do at work. That would be weird.
Yeah, that's acceptable.
It's not going to go well. So I feel the pressure of that, and I think to spend more time on kind of which side of this divide to fall on and how to reconcile them.
But your talk was really great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Jessica, please. In my opinion, your presentation concerned most important relations between logic and practice. And I like it very much, thank you. And my question concerns more logic. I would call it the logic of internally inconsistent but mutually, logic of internally consistent but mutually inconsistent fragments. Right? This is what you, from logical point of view, not from internal one. And my question is, could you formulate some laws of this logic? Of course, yes, of course, logic of laws of inconsistency fails there, but logic of excluded middle probably works, I think. Could you tell something more about it, or at least try to find out it?
Yeah. So within the fragments. So this is the trick that Elga and Ryo use, and I feel like it counts as a trick, so I don't love it. But this is the they're evaluating rationality at the level of the salient sentences. So they're evaluating like the things between which you need to be, sentences between which you need to be consistent is only the salient sentences. Even though those are going to be taken as propositions over possible worlds, the difference that they are making is that you can have interpretations of the connectives that are deviant in certain possible worlds, right? So we get away from requiring standard coherence between the sentences, but we're still classically just Bayesian at the level of the probability function itself. So like we're respecting all of the entailments between propositions, but not between sentences. And so one of the things that I want to think a lot more about is how far apart those can come if we start allowing for rule sets that are non-classical. And I think that's going to involve a lot of, I don't think, it's not clear to me anyway that the very classical probability function based model is going to work in that view, which is a long way of saying I don't yet know. But I'm very interested in any thoughts that you have on this. Part of my goal here is like getting help from all of you on this exact aspect of this particular model. Yeah, does that kind of help situate kind of where I am? Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry, it's a short one. Just something. So, yeah, it's in this direction because I was curious about if you have thought about the logic underlying your framework, and excellent talk to begin with. And there is this a logic called Gödel modal logic, which
What is it?
Gödel, which is like a Phi modal logic, where you can assign weights to the accessibility relation. So you have modalities, and then you can assign weights to them. Of course, I mean, you are not coping with vagueness, but probability. So you will have to adapt compositionality there.
Yeah, that's really useful though. Can we chat more about that afterwards?
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Awesome, yeah, I would.
Actually, it's in Studia Logica.
Ah, great. Perfect.
Full circle.
Yes.
Yeah, that sounds like a potentially very fruitful avenue. Thank you.
Oh, so there is time after all.
That's okay. I don't want to ask this question. I think I misread one of the things that she wrote.
Okay. So anyone else?
Can I make a 10-second suggestion?
Yes.
There's a paper, I think it's by Floridi and D'Agostino, called The Enduring Scandal of Deduction, is logic uninformative? And it deals with virtual information, and it's has some overlap conceptually. And I would imagine, I have a suspicion, I haven't read the paper in 15 years, but, God, I'm getting old. But I would imagine that virtual information, that might be something that you could translate into this.
Yeah.
It might be worth looking at.
Yeah, no, actually, I really love that suggestion because the sort of scandal of deduction is one of the things that I've been really interested in the epistemology of attention more broadly, is like, why do we care about proof? Well, because it's a scaffold for our attention, right? Like, what makes a proof useful to you is that you understand the little steps, right? And so you can sort of agree with each of them and then have this external device that keeps that all available to you, so you can wander through this, like, 20 steps or whatever, and arrive at the conclusion in a way that respects your actual cognitive capacities. Whereas, like, if you're just looking at a sea of propositions, you're not able to necessarily understand all of the relationships between them at once. The proof scaffolds you through. So yeah, that's really helpful. I'm not familiar with that paper, so thank you.
It's a cool paper, yeah. Right. Do you want to jump in about your supervisors?
No, it will be like, I don't know.
Hasn't read it yet.
What is my what's the question for that? Anyway, yeah, it's I have worked with this approach with D'Agostino, and I guess that you can accommodate that because you can measure sort of the depth, but it will be within a proof system. But I'm gonna talk this on Friday, so probably.
Oh, great!
You know, it's,
You should wait for that.
Yeah.
Cool, yeah.
So,
Thank
okay,
you.
I think time's over. Let's thank.